Good morning and welcome to Trevor Phillips on Sunday. The mists are clearing. As most of the country moves from Plan B back to Plan A, the masks are coming off at work and at school, and we can finally see the smile as well as the frown on each other's faces. Abroad, the mask may be slipping from the inscrutable Mr. Putin. According to our intelligence services, Russia plans to install a puppet regime in Ukraine. The Foreign Office has even named some of its likely members. Normally, nobody can see what goes on behind the Tory whip's closed doors, but this morning, a former Conservative minister accuses Tory disciplinarians of citing her Muslim faith as a reason for her sacking. Usually, they would respond tersely. You might say that, but I couldn't possibly comment. But this time, the chief whip has outed himself to say that her account is categorically untrue and defamatory. And if all that openness isn't enough for you, sometime this week, the veil should be lifted on Sue Gray's long-anticipated report on party time in Downing Street. Can't wait. Let's see what more we can reveal during the next 60 minutes. With this country facing another invasion by Russia and the world stumbling into a dangerous and intensifying East-West struggle, we'll be joined by Ukraine's ambassador to the UK, Vadim Pristaiko. The government here faces its own range of threats, from Sue Gray's report and the political danger Boris Johnson remains in, to the rising cost of living and looming tax rises. So I'll talk to Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary Dominic Raab. And we'll get the view from Labour, from Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry. With number 10 in seemingly perpetual crisis, we'll speak to a man who knows what it's like to do that top job. Former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who's deeply concerned about a lack of aid for Afghanistan. And with COVID restrictions eased in schools, we'll speak to the Children's Commissioner, Dame Rachel de Souza. But first, I'm joined by the Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab. Good morning, Deputy Prime Minister.
Good morning.
Can I start by asking about what can only be described as a truly extraordinary statement from your old department, Foreign Office, alleging that Mr. Putin plans to install what amounts to a puppet regime in the Ukraine. What evidence do you have for that?
Well, look, the Foreign Secretary and the Foreign Office have come out making it clear what the designs of the Russian government are. We, of course, don't go into things like sources, but it's very clear there is a concerted, not just military build-up on the border, but threat to the democracy, the integrity of Ukraine. And I think the important point to note in all of this is it's building up slowly. I think President Putin and Moscow have had this habit of trying to take advantage of opportunities when the world's attention is perhaps elsewhere. And the Foreign Secretary is quite rightly pointing to the designs that Russia has. And we're saying really two things. First of all, Ukraine is a free country. Under international law, it should decide its own fate. We will support them in defending themselves. But also to the international community, European, NATO allies, the US, we're standing shoulder to shoulder, saying there'll be very serious consequences if Russia takes this move to try and invade, but also install a puppet regime.
OK, well, if you know all of that, you've obviously prepared for the possibility of that puppet regime. What are you going to do about it?
Well, we wouldn't telegraph all of the measures that we would take, but it's important that this very clear message, not just from the UK, but from all NATO and other interested countries around the world who want to uphold the rule of law, that there'll be very serious, severe economic consequences. And of course, Ukraine will defend itself.
Like what?
Well, it will obviously involve a range of financial and economic sanctions. We wouldn't telegraph those in advance. But what you can rest assured is that the Foreign Secretary, the Foreign Office and the Defence Secretary will be liaising with all of our partners, engaging, and we have been doing so for many months, to make sure that the response is robust and concerted. At the same time, of course, what we really want is to get this message so clearly to Moscow that President Putin walks away from the brink. That is the off-ramp that we would all like to see.
But let's be concrete. What actually would you do? For example, Swiss bank accounts.
Well, as I said, I can give you the areas. I'm not going to go into all the details, not only because that's counterproductive.
But, OK, would that be one area?
We would look at
the personal interests of Vladimir Putin and his friends in the Kremlin?
Well, we already have, and you'll remember I introduced the Magnitsky sanctions to allow asset freezes and visa bans to be imposed not just for human rights abuses, but also for severe corruption. All the tools at our disposal, whether it's sectoral, financial, economic sanctions, but also individual targeted sanctions, are on the table. And of course, the two things that the Kremlin care about are, would they get locked into a quagmire in Ukraine? I think there's a very serious risk of that. But also, will they suffer an economic price? And of course, things like Nord Stream 2 and what the Europeans are willing to do on that is going to be critically important.
Nord Stream is in the hands of the Germans, and we don't know what they'll do. But I'm very interested in this point about the Swiss, and we know about Magnitsky. But would you be prepared, for example, to make the case for the Russians to be locked out of the international banking system?
Well, I certainly think financial sanctions, properly targeted and done in concert with our major partners, is something that we would readily look at.
Is our government prepared, aside from all of the words, for an invasion of the Ukraine? And were there to be an incursion, major, minor, whatever, what would we do? Would we send troops?
I think it's extremely unlikely that we would do that. But what we have said is that we are already willing and engaged in training programs to support the Ukrainians defending themselves. That's absolutely right, for defensive purposes. And secondly, as I made clear, we want to make sure that the economic cost to the Kremlin of doing so is sufficiently severe that they think twice. What we want, and the Americans are obviously engaged in the diplomacy, Liz Truss, the Foreign Office are as well. We want Putin to step back and realise how damaging this would be for him, let alone for Ukraine and the international community.
OK, before we move on, I just want to ask you what might be, if you like, a personal question. Your father fled Czechoslovakia in 1938 after the Munich Agreement, ahead of Hitler's invasion of the Sudetenland. Which most people now regard as a sort of the paramount example of appeasement that led to disaster. Can you understand why this morning people in Ukraine might welcome your words but still be absolutely terrified that they will mean nothing to Vladimir Putin?
Look, I can absolutely empathise with the plight of the Ukrainian people. I think, actually, if you look at what civil society and many of the, and indeed what the government of Ukraine is saying, they're hugely grateful for the forthright, clear, sensible and calm but resolute response that we've shown to them. Now, Ukraine is not part of NATO. The self-defence, the collective self-defence provisions don't apply. But nonetheless, it is a free country that deserves to have its integrity, its direction decided by its own people. And we stand shoulder to shoulder with them and all other countries that want to respect for the international rule of law in doing so.
Okay. This morning, the former Conservative Minister, Nasrat Ghani, claims that her Muslim faith was cited as a reason for her sacking. It's a pretty serious allegation. Do you believe her?
Well, look, I know Nuz, and I've looked at that allegation, seen what she's said. It is incredibly serious. Let me just be clear at the outset. We have absolute zero tolerance for any discrimination and any Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, and you'll be familiar with the review that was conducted by Professor Singh. Just on these specific allegations, it's very unusual, but the Chief Whip has come out and said the conversation concerned was with him, this is Mark Spencer, and he's categorically denied it in what can only be described as the most forthright and robust terms. Indeed, as you said, calling it defamatory. The one point I would note is that I think if there are any claims like this, they should result in a formal complaint which allows a formal investigation to take place. And as the Chief Whip has pointed out, Nuz hasn't made a formal complaint. She was asked to do so. This relates back to 2020. And in the absence of doing so, there would be no specific investigation into this.
I get that, but you're a lawyer. You're used to forensics. She says, he said this. He says, I didn't say it. They cannot both be right. Who do you believe?
Yes, but I'm not going to get into that because I know it gives
that's the point.
Yeah, but so Trevor, as you know, what that gives is everyone a headline, whereas actually I want to tackle the issue. I think if there's any claim like this, a formal complaint should be made. And as the Chief Whip has said, that Nuz was invited to make a formal complaint. She still is able to do so. She hasn't yet done so. So I'm not going to start getting into impugning anyone's integrity. That's not the business I'm in. I'm in the business of zero tolerance for any Islamophobia. And a claim like this, as serious as it is, should be properly reported, and then a proper investigation.
OK, so if she makes the formal complaint, you would favour a proper investigation in the party?
I think the Chief Whip made this clear back in 2020.
All right. Now, look, this is just one more example. I mean, on this particular thing, it's possible, as someone wise once said, that recollections might vary. But this is just one more issue that's dogging the Conservative Party. We started talking by talking about Ukraine. Nothing could be more serious or dramatic than the threat of war.
Yeah, but that's not an issue dogging the Conservative Party.
No, but let me finish. Let me finish my question. Yeah, the point is that we have to deal with what you yourself called the soap opera in Downing Street and squabbles and scandals. This is pretty poor government, isn't it?
No, I don't think. Actually, if you look at this week, Trevor, the two big issues that will most affect people up and down this country is the fact that our vaccine rollout and the booster campaign has been hugely successful. The Prime Minister got that right over Christmas and in the months before. A major decision. And as a result, we've got over 80% of eligible adults vaccinated. That reduces that cuts the risk of hospitalisation by 88%. And if we'd have listened to the Labour Party, by the way, whose manifesto was calling for the nationalisation of pharmaceutical companies, who wanted us pegged to the EU, we wouldn't be.
Your colleague said that to me last week. I've got all that.
No, but there's a big thing that's happened this week, Trevor, if I may. So, big decision. Prime Minister got it right. Keir has got it wrong. It hasn't taken it. The other big thing is that we're coming through lockdown. We're coming out of those restrictions. The economy, fastest growing in the G7. Jobs are up. Wages are up. Big call. And back in July, Keir Starmer said it would be reckless. So what I would say to you, when you challenge me with the charge that the government is a shambles and this, that and the other, on the two biggest decisions of the day, coming out this week, it's topical. Prime Minister got it right. Keir Starmer got it wrong.
Yeah, I didn't use the word shambles. I wouldn't be so rude. But my point is very, very straightforward. You might think this is the most important thing. Indeed, this programme, which deals with these issues, thinks these things are important. But nobody is talking about that. What they're talking about...
You mean the media's not talking about it?
Well,
when I knock on doors...
come on. In the pubs, in Isha, that's what they're talking about.
With the greatest respect, I was out campaigning last weekend, this weekend, and actually people are asking about jobs, livelihoods. The cost of living is a big issue, but of course, if we'd have listened to Keir, we wouldn't have been out of lockdown. Yeah, and hold on, wages are rising. So all I'm just saying is, let's have some perspective.
To come to all of that
let's have some perspective, because on the big issues facing my constituents, your viewers, the country, the Prime Minister has got those big decisions right. Keir Starmer has got them wrong.
Yeah, and we talk about the big issues all the time, but let me put it this way. Some of my colleagues would say, you at Sky, you keep going on about these big things. The only story that matters and that we are hearing from our viewers, our readers and so on, about is the government's character, the Prime Minister's conduct. Let me put it to you again.
Yes.
I agree with you about these big issues. We buy all of that. The problem is that you're, as a government, paralysed because you can't get past... You have to keep saying, wait for Sue Gray, wait for that. You can't get past that issue yet.
Well, let me answer that directly. So, yes, of course, it's a distraction. Yes, these are serious issues. Yes, Sue Gray must decide them in a very serious way. But I would say this week we've shown that we are dealing with the big issues, that we haven't been distracted because we're being able to ease up on the lockdown measures. That only happens because of the success of the vaccine rollout. That only happens because the Prime Minister held his nerve when others, including the Labour Party, were calling him to stay in lockdown measures. As a result, fastest growing economy in the G7 and unemployment coming down. Funnily enough, I mean, just to give you a sense of big picture, unemployment is 4%, notwithstanding all that we've seen in the pandemic. That is half the level that Gordon Brown, who's coming on your show, left in 2010.
Yes, well, let's go there. Let's go to the economy. I agree with you, it's the biggest issue. It is probably what they are talking to you in the... I don't know, the Wheatsheaf, the Prince of Wales, whatever it is. In your
Wheatsheaf is one of my local pubs.
There you go. In the Wheatsheaf, I bet you they're talking in between the gastro meals. They're talking about these things. You used to tell us that the governments that delivered runaway public spending, soaring inflation, and tax rises were Labour administrations. Are you proud that your government's delivered all of those things?
Look, I'm proud that in the eyes of the worst pandemic, probably the biggest challenge we've seen nationally, probably globally, since World War II, we've saved 15 million jobs through the furlough scheme. The vaccine rollout scheme has not just saved thousands of lives, it's the fastest in Europe. We're the most tested in Europe. And as a result of that, the economy now is getting back to the pre-pandemic levels, fastest growing in the G7. And we're providing not just protection for their lives, but the livelihoods of people up and down this country. Yes, I am. And actually, I don't take a theological view of these things when you're in the eye of the storm of the worst emergency we've seen in living memory.
Yeah, but, you're saying we're coming back to normal, the economy is good, but as I say, 7% inflation, public spending soaring, on housing, energy, we're now going to see increases in the proportion of our income spent on energy because of rising prices. For the poorest 10% in this country, housing costs at 40% of their income. Is that what the new normal's going to look like? That's not that thrilling.
It's a totally fair challenge. So, of course, inflation is rising, but it will come down. We're putting £12 billion of economic support in this year. Extending the personal allowance is something we've done, an extra £1,000 for all workers. The taper on universal credit means that 2 million of the lowest paid will get a further £1,000. The winter fuel payments, the various other measures we're dealing, the energy cap, and all of those measures are there to provide support for those on the lowest incomes and who are feeling the pinch. But the one thing I wouldn't do is nationalise the energy companies, because if you look, which is what Labour proposed, if you look at what the Confederation of British Industry has said, that would be hugely damaging, not just energy supply, but it would hike bills. So again, on the big issues, we, under this Prime Minister, under this Chancellor, have got targeted measures, the right calls in difficult times, and Labour's approach would be an absolute disaster for the very people you're talking about.
You keep wanting to take me back to the Labour Party. That's fine.
Choices, Trevor. It's all about decisions and choices.
OK, let me deal with that with Emily Thornberry, and let's focus on you. My point that I'm really trying to put to you is we're faced with threat of war, economic storm brewing, potentially, by the way, collapse of the health service because all of the people who are not vaccinated in the health service are going to be sacked.
Well, I don't think that's true. I can't accept that.
Oh, well, let's deal with that.
Yeah.
It is thought that 73,000 or thereabouts health staff will be sacked because they haven't been vaccinated. The Royal College of General Practitioners chair today says, could you delay this? Yeah. Otherwise, health service is going to fall over. What are you going to do about that?
So first of all, there's a huge package of support for the COVID recovery in the NHS. We've got 9 out of 10 NHS staff vaccinated. There's been a big push to encourage vaccinations. That's really important. It shows the progress that we've made, and we would encourage anyone to come forward and get those jabs before the deadline. But we've also got to think about the people who will be at risk if NHS staff don't have the vaccine. And just on resilience, we've got almost 5,000 more doctors, almost 11,000 more nurses than we did in 2020, precisely to provide the support. So I'm afraid I just don't accept on the facts that challenge.
All right. Well, look, before we finish, I must just come back to this point. I've mentioned... I haven't mentioned Sue Gray too much because I know what you're going to tell me. We've got to wait for what she says and so on. But the point is, we understand her report's now going to be delayed because there are even more parties to investigate. She's going to re-interview Dominic Cummings tomorrow, I understand. Another Red Wall Tory MP submitted a letter of no confidence. It really is looking pretty grim for your government, your Prime Minister, and this is more than a distraction. It is paralysing you.
Well, first of all, I accept the seriousness of the issue. That's why Sue Gray should be able to determine who, when and how she investigates. But I would point to the decisions we made this week, the success of the vaccine rollout, the measures to open up the economy, none of which would have happened if we'd have listened to the Labour Party, all of which show actually, notwithstanding...
It's not their problem, it's your problem.
Absolutely, and all of which show that notwithstanding all of these other issues, significant as though they are, the PM is taking the right calls, the big decisions to lead us through the worst pandemic in living memory.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much indeed. Talk to you. Now, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, was clearly enjoying himself at Prime Minister's questions this week, attacking Boris Johnson, calling for him to resign. He was bolstered by the defection of a Tory MP and party grandee David Davis, calling for the Prime Minister to go. Well, all eyes will now be on Sue Gray's report into Downing Street parties, expected in the next few days. So let's find out how Labour is going to tackle this critical moment. I'm joined by Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry. Good morning.
Morning, Trevor.
We'll come to the party politics in a moment, but I just want to start with some of the wider issues that I discussed with Deputy Prime Minister. Is Labour satisfied that the government's doing all it can in the circumstances, including having sent weapons and personnel to Ukraine, about the Russian threat?
I think that what's really important is, and Putin knows this, he has an absolute nose for it, is that we have to be completely unified on this. We have to be strong and we have to be unified, whether it's within NATO, our surrounding allies, and we have to play our part as the opposition also in making sure that in Britain we stand unified against this threat. Because in the end, Putin will take advantage of any disunity and any weakness that we show. So, yes, we stand with the government on this. We think that we absolutely need to. It is outrageous, the threats that Putin is making, the claims that he's trying to make in terms of telling Ukraine what it should do in the future. And we need to stand up to it. But I tell you what I think also is I don't think that we use sanctions as well as we could do. I think that we could be much more imaginative in the way that we do. There is a new generation of sanctions out there, which, to be honest, the previous guy sitting it. Well, there's a power, for example, to go for wealth that can't be explained. Unexplained wealth. And there are many Russian citizens in Britain at the moment who have unexplained wealth. You know, we ought to be much stronger on that. We ought to be much stronger when it comes to making sure that party donations are completely tight. We have to make sure that anybody in the House of Commons or in the Lords who are sitting on any foreign companies ought to be on any foreign company boards, ought to have that in the register of interest. There's a whole lot of things that we could do in terms of tightening up potential influence in Britain, but also making sure that we are not the laundering capital of the world.
I get all of that, but let's be honest. Mr. Putin doesn't seem to give much weight to appeal to his better nature or indeed to financial threats to any of his friends. So what would you actually do to forestall an invasion?
Well, I don't know about financial threats to his friends and not taking that seriously. I don't think that we have been particularly serious in terms of the financial threats to the friends. I think that's the point. I think absolutely, you know, if we threatened his friends, we may well be threatening his money as well. I do think this is a new generation of sanctions. This is a new way in which you can do foreign policy very effectively. And I think that we're not imaginative enough and we're not strong enough in terms of the way in which we use it.
OK, as Shadow Attorney General, what do you make of this rather extraordinary statement by the Foreign Office, naming people that it thinks could be part of a puppet regime in Kiev?
Well, we do know that Putin has been trying to meddle in the affairs of Ukraine for a long time, and indeed more than that. You know, when he invaded part of Ukraine, and we continue to have cyber attacks in Ukraine, and so therefore any attempt to influence, you know, future politics in Ukraine goes absolutely hand in hand with that. But that's why, as I said at the outset, it's so important that we are strong and that we remain united against the threat from Putin, because that's what he goes for.
I'm being told that, in fact, the Russians have actually responded to this statement. They call it disinformation and an escalation of tensions by the West.
Well, there we are. I mean, sorry, but we just have to stand up to these people.
OK, well, maybe at some point we'll see Emily Thornberry versus Vladimir Putin.
No, I think the point is not that. The point is it may be Vladimir Putin versus a united West. That's what's important.
COVID. The Royal College of General Practitioners, their chair, says this morning that forcing health staff to be vaccinated should be delayed and that it's not the right way forward. Do you agree?
I think that whatever we decide we've got to do, we really ought to be working on the basis of working with those within the health service and within the union movement. So if we decide that it's a better idea to put this measure off, then, as I say, so long as we're working with others on it, we just need to move forward together on this. Yeah,
but that's... when we actually disagree, it's not possible to move forward. The point of politics is to decide what you should do. Do you think that those who, as the Deputy Prime Minister said, those who will not be vaccinated working in the health service because they might put others in danger should then lose their jobs?
The principle behind that, I'm afraid we do agree with. But the question is, when should that policy be implemented? There is discussion about putting off the deadline in relation to that. And if we're going to put off the deadline, then we need to work with the hospitals and with the trade union movement about how it is that we can convince as many people as possible who work within the health service to get themselves vaccinated. Nobody works in the National Health Service who doesn't come into the service, not for the money, but in order to make sure they help others. And, and arguments need to be put before them to say you're not helping others by not being vaccinated.
All right, well, let's deal with some of the wider issues that are discussed with the Deputy Prime Minister, the economy particularly. Can I confirm that Labour wants the government to drop its planned rise in national insurance and also to forbid any rise in the level of the energy price cap? That's
what we want to do. Is we want to cut VAT on energy because, to be honest, the government has had a bit of a windfall because, obviously as prices go up, they get more VAT out of it. So we're saying, drop the VAT. That will result in hundreds of pounds being available to families. We also want to be able to have a windfall tax on the energy companies who themselves are also making much greater profits as a result. And we want that money to be targeted on the squeezed middle, on the poorest, on pensioners, to make sure that they're given assistance with their energy. It's all fully costed. We're really surprised the government doesn't have a plan, but as the opposition, we're helping them out. We've got a plan. We've put it on the table. We said, here you are, use this.
When you say you're helping them out, this is a bit puzzling. The Labour Party wants to stop a tax rise that, being a percentage of income, is, by its nature, hits the wealthier hardest. You want to stop their VAT change. You also, by the way, want to keep the BBC licence fee, which is a flat tax. All of these are regressive measures. I mean, when did the Labour Party of redistribution become in favour of regressive taxation?
Well, I don't think that the national insurance tax is as you describe. I think one of the most important things about the national insurance tax is that it's a tax on jobs and it's a tax on employers. And if we want to have full employment, we need to make life as easy as possible.
Employees have to pay it too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But it's also a tax on jobs. It's a disincentive for employers to take on more people. This can't be right at a time like this. These are the reasons behind the decisions that we've made, and it's not regressive. What we've said in relation to energy is we've said everybody's going to have their bills largely increased by 50%, just in a few months' time. The government just seems to be like rabbits in the headlights, just standing there thinking, oh my goodness, we're about to get run over. But what we need to do is we need to do something about it. So we've said, get rid of VAT, that will help everyone, but then also have this targeted money, which would be available for the poorest.
All right, well, look, let's deal with, this is a politics show, let's deal with politics. You have, in your own way, spent a lot of this conversation telling me about the shortcomings of this government. Last week, your colleague Wes Streeting told me that you wouldn't move a vote of no confidence in Parliament because you didn't think you'd have the numbers. I don't get this. If he's as bad for the nation as you're always saying he is, well, first of all, what does that tell you about the parliamentary party he leads?
Well, look, they have a majority of 80. That's why, in the end, it isn't for the opposition to... And the Prime Minister ought to be...
But if he's so terrible, not all of those Conservatives are people without conscience. Why can't you bring them across to your side for this point?
Well, we're doing our bit. We're doing our best. We are making it perfectly clear what our criticisms are. We're making the argument as to why this Prime Minister is totally unfit to continue to be at number 10. And the latest allegations
why
about...
Why don't you try and turf him out?
We are doing our best to try and turf him out, but they do have a majority of 80. And in the end, although the Prime Minister is answerable to Parliament, the Parliament is skewed in that they have a majority of 80. So there is a great deal... I mean, the Prime Minister's future rests in his own conscience. He can make his own decision. But then next, it is for Tory MPs to decide whether or not they want to continue to support him. And we continue to put the argument as to why it is. And frankly, so do the public. I mean, most Tory MPs get large numbers of letters from members of the public saying, do the right thing, push this Prime Minister out. So first of all, I would encourage backbench MPs to put the letters in, and then, we will hear from Sue Gray. Let's take these things step by step.
All right. Just very quickly, one thing they will always say about Emily Thornberry is that she's a realist. Isn't the real truth here that actually a wounded Boris Johnson is better for you than Boris Johnson gone with a better leader?
I think that Boris Johnson wounded, Boris Johnson full stop, as Prime Minister, does this country no good. And that's why we want to get rid of him.
Emily Thornberry, thank you very much indeed.
Not at all.
It is 8 years since Russia invaded Ukraine and seized Crimea. In reality, in one form or another, that country's been at war ever since. 13,000 Ukrainians have died as Moscow-backed separatists continue fighting in the east of the country. Moscow has 100,000 troops on the border. Talks with NATO and the US promise little, and in reality, there's not much Western powers can do. Now, the UK Foreign Office, in an extraordinary release to journalists last night, says Moscow is poised to overthrow the Kiev government and install a puppet prime minister as it considers another full-blown invasion. Ukraine's ambassador to the UK, Vadim Pristaiko, joins me now. Good morning, Ambassador. The Foreign Office released this statement. We have information that indicates the Russian government is looking to install a pro-Russian leader in Kiev as it considers whether to invade and occupy Ukraine. Do you believe that?
I do believe that. It's not the first time they're trying to do so, historically, and even in recent times. And by the way, all the names you mentioned, and these people actually were helped from Ukraine to Russia, and they now reside in Russia by Russian special services.
Do you actually have any evidence, or do you think that Foreign Office has actual evidence of this?
These people, including former Prime Minister Mr. Azarov, is appearing from time to time on Russian state TV and talking about what could be achieved if he is back in service. And even the President Yanukovych is in Russia, in Rostov-on-Don. So all these people are handy at hand if they need it. And that's what Russia is doing. By the way, they are fighting in the courts, and even London courts, for 3 billion euros, which these people received from Russia in exchange not to sign the European Association Agreement. So all of the things, if you combine, you will see a much bigger picture.
You mentioned Mr. Azarov. One of the other individuals, Mr. Moraev, has said this morning that this claim is, I'm quoting here, stupidity and nonsense. He denies it, points out that he is banned from Russia, so he's hardly likely to be a Russian agent.
Mr. Muraev is an active Ukrainian politician, yes, with pro-Russian views, but we allow this discussion to go on in Ukraine. This guy is just quite openly appears on TV. He has his own TV channel, and he tells whatever he wants. But I believe that he's a young politician. He also is building up his resume, and that's what he's trying to do, you know, appealing to the forces in Ukrainian society who still believe that Soviet Union and Russia is the best way for Ukrainians to develop.
Do you and the Ukrainian government genuinely think that Mr. Putin will invade Ukraine?
We don't just think that he would. He, as you mentioned rightly, not many people, by the way, remember that he is already there. He is already in Ukraine for all this almost 8 years. So there is not big news for us. The issue is how much he would bring up with. Is it full-scale invasion, or it is, as was mentioned, discussed many times, smaller things, just, you know, to annoy us and the rest of the world, to show his strength and believe that we will back down.
Is Ukraine prepared to fight militarily?
Very unfortunately, we are prepared to fight. We are gathering the forces. We have times more than Russians are now keeping at our border, but again, we are not that well equipped for the prolonged fight with Russians.
The British, I think, have sent you some weapons and some trainers. We understand that Germany has decided not to do the same, and indeed has blocked another country from doing so. What are your feelings about Germany today?
This camera is around not allowing me to tell what I think of Germany right now. If I have somebody from NATO to say something...
It's just you and me. Tell us...
You know, if I have somebody from NATO to tell things like that, I would expect Germany to be the last ones. So many Ukrainians still remember what Germans did in our part of the globe, and Ukraine especially.
We're talking 80, 90 years ago.
We are talking about both of the world wars, and both of them were now a part of the globe. And our lands were occupied, and there is no Ukrainian family which was not touched by these wars.
That is quite a major accusation to throw at the current German government that it is repeating the treatment of Ukrainians from the last century.
That's not what I said. What I said is that if I have to listen from somebody about things like Ukraine is not to be given the weapons to defend itself, the Germans would have to stay at the very end of this long, long line of our European partners.
Okay, you are not going to rely on Germany because you think they will never really come to your aid.
We rely on them in economic sanctions if they're serious with that, but I don't see the seriousness when they are still keeping laying down the pipelines going around our territory.
So would you like them, for example, to cancel Nord Stream?
Oh, absolutely. That's what we ask them so many times. Our pipelines allow us as much of the gas to come as they want, even more. So there is no particular need. And we understand that each and every nation in NATO, in Europe, can do their part. Germany has to play some significant role. If they're not ready to provide us weapons, defensive weapons, okay, they might do something else which will help us.
I'm sure that will be heard in Berlin. In Washington, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has been holding talks with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. What are the Ukrainian government's red lines? What does it say to the Americans you must never give way on in these negotiations?
It's a very good issue because we've been talking about this supposedly happening big deal between Russians and Americans. And what we were always saying to our American colleagues, that if you promise too much as a compromise, please be coordinating with us because some things we won't be able to do just for our own future. Something like that, like we will still go to NATO and European Union. This is for NATO and EU to decide whether they were becoming a part of the family. But that's what we wanted to do. And that's why we actually suffered all these years. Not because we're different. We've been living with Russians for centuries. That's because we decided to take another model of our development, which is European, Western, democratic, whatever the words we will use to describe it.
So for clarity, is the Ukraine's current position that it would like to join the EU and also at some stage NATO?
Absolutely. That's what we made clear 8 years ago, and that's why Russians came. And it did not change our resolve even in an inch.
So a clear signal to Washington that whatever you do, whatever you agree, do not agree to the Russian demand that the Ukraine should not be allowed to join NATO.
Yeah, please leave it outside the conversation. The rockets, the forces in Europe, there are some things which Americans can discuss, and that's in their own power, because most of these troops are American. But something which Ukraine will suffer, please coordinate it with us first.
The underlying point here is, does the West have the stomach for the fight? What is the view in Ukraine at the moment? Earlier in the week, President Biden said the United States might tolerate a minor incursion in Ukraine, and he's retracted the phrase since then. But do you essentially believe that when it comes to the final decision, Vladimir Putin and against the West, that the West has the stomach, to face down Putin?
I believe it's getting there. If you look at all these years, 7+ years, when we start asking people to help us with some military equipment to defend ourselves, we couldn't even start this negotiation. After 7 years, we already have seen the doors opened. UK, United States, some other nations are coming openly to send us weapons, which is not important only as a military step, but this is a political step. The political stance they are showing Russians, you know what? We understood it. After all these years, you killed so many of the Ukrainians, 13,500. It's not minor incursion anymore. This is war. If you can step down, please do it. That's still a chance for that.
We here are a long way away from this, and, to some extent, if I'm honest, and I may have been guilty of it this morning, we treat Mr. Putin as a sort of fascinating character and joke a bit about him. But what do Ukrainians really feel about this? If the diplomatic channels fail and that there is an invasion, what will the Ukraine do?
We have nowhere to go. I mean, we corner it in our own biggest land in Europe, but still that's enough for us, and we are not inviting them to our. We will fight to death, unfortunately. So many people of our nation will probably die, but we will try to get to that world as many Russians as they come.
The picture that you paint, what do you think the scale of that conflict could be? How serious could it be?
I believe, I still hope that this is just threats as of now. Russians might change their mind, especially Putin. Who knows what he's at? He might want to, regain the Soviet Union. By the way, it's 100th anniversary of formal formation of Soviet Union this year. He might come to this particular date. I love it very much. But I believe that West will, with each and every step, West will, stiffen the spine and will come to our citizens. But we're not relying to it much. We are preparing ourselves.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your time this morning. No doubt we will speak again about this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Back in the late summer, the news was dominated by one thing: Afghanistan and the rushed, chaotic, some might even say humiliating withdrawal of Western forces. But has the world now forgotten? 23 million people now face one of the harshest winters in the world, with little food. Hundreds of millions of dollars of aid and assets remain blocked. Former Prime Minister Gordon Brown says the world must act and the money must flow. He joins me now. Good morning, Mr. Brown. Let's start with Afghanistan. You say it's an unfolding humanitarian disaster. The aid is urgently needed. But I suppose there will be people watching this who will say, why should we be giving money to a country controlled by a murderous regime that's rolling back human rights, especially for women, hard won, including by the sacrifice of our own troops?
This is a humanitarian catastrophe. I don't forget the sacrifice of our troops, and part of the reason we were there was to protect the Afghan people. And now we face a nightmare. We face a catastrophe. It's really a moral failure, because when children are starving and when families are emaciated and when there is no health provision, and despite polio, cholera and COVID, I think we've got a duty to act. Now, there are self-interested reasons for acting. We want to prevent terrorists gaining the upper hand again and exporting their terrorism to the West. We want to prevent heroin getting to the streets of Britain. We also want to prevent mass migration, and already 3 million have left Afghanistan. But as Rowan Williams and I said in an article yesterday, there is also a duty to help children in particular and families with this immediate threat of starvation itself. And this is a matter of days, not weeks and months. If we cannot get aid to people, they will die in front of our eyes. And we've already seen TV pictures of children so emaciated that they will not survive. So it's humanitarian. And I don't think anybody, any father, any mother in the world would say that when children are in this difficulty, we should fail to act. What we've got to do is find a way around this that does not legitimize the regime, that gives them no credibility for the aid that we're giving, gets the money through the NGOs and through the United Nations organizations, and make sure it's absolutely clear that the help is being provided by people who have wanted to help the people of Afghanistan over the last 20 years.
I'm sure a powerful case can be made morally for this, but you yourself have just raised the point when you talked about getting the money to NGOs. How can we be sure that that money is going to get to the places where it's needed and where people can be fed and sheltered and kept safe over winter?
Well, I'm already chairman of the Education Cannot Wait organisation that helps refugees and displaced people. And you are able, and UNICEF is being able to do this, to make informal arrangements at a local level where you can pay the salaries of teachers and health workers, and at the same time make sure girls can go to school and make sure that people are actually fed. So there are ways at the moment. Martin Griffiths, the humanitarian coordinator for the United Nations, is showing that through the United Nations, the World Bank, and through many NGOs, we can actually get aid to people. The problem is that there is an appeal now for $4.5 billion. That's urgently needed for the 23 million people that you talked about to prevent them starving, and only a quarter of that money has been raised. Now, There were 40 countries in the coalition in Afghanistan. What I'm suggesting, and there is a petition now circulating through Save the Children asking the British public to support this, what I'm suggesting is that Britain and the European Union call a humanitarian conference, bring the 40 countries together, get the money in, make sure it's actually going to the starving children and to the families in need. But all that can be done, but the money has not been raised. And one of the reasons I'm making this appeal this morning with the churches and faith groups who've signed a letter also is that I believe the British public can ask the government to pay attention to this, call the conference, get this done. And of course, there are talks starting with the Taliban in Norway today. And first on the agenda will be this issue of humanitarian aid getting through without giving credibility to the regime itself.
You, of course, are able to make this appeal because you've been for many years amongst world leaders and you've been at all of the conferences and talks and so on and so forth. The big issue that would occupy those conversations today, of course, is Ukraine. Do you actually think anything is going to come from the talks with Vladimir Putin about Ukraine?
Well, let me say, first of all, the same principle applies to Afghanistan as Ukraine. You do need leadership. You need people to act together. You do need unity. And one of the problems in Afghanistan is we need a country to lead this humanitarian effort and to call the conference. I think the same applies in Ukraine. President Putin will exploit any weakness, any failure to show strength, and in particular, any failure to show unity. Will give a blank check, if you like, to continued aggression. Now, we know that the demands he's making are completely unreasonable. He wants to remove weapons from members of NATO's soils. He wants to prevent Sweden and Finland ever joining NATO. He wants the NATO countries to say that they will not enlist any countries in the future. Now, he's making unreasonable demands. And of course, the only way to deal with that, because if you accede to one, you'll simply get another set of demands on top of them, is to show strength. And that's why I think what Emily Thornberry said this morning is really important, that you've got to have a united West and a united set of allies. And of course, that is something that is in question this weekend. And again, I think Britain, America and the Western allies have got to come together and show that they are completely agreed on the need for sanctions, that they will be financial, they'll be economic, they'll be targeted on individual people. We will not hesitate to apply them quickly. And I think that message has got to go out without any danger that there is not unanimity.
Paul Volcker, the senior American diplomat, who I'm pretty sure you will know, said last week that programme that you've just outlined would be the right thing to do. But even so, he did not think that it would prevent a Russian invasion, because if that's what Mr. Putin wants to do, that's what he wants to do, it's what he will do, and nothing we can do can stop him.
Well, you know, we know that President Putin wants to declare a sphere of influence that extends way beyond the borders of Russia itself. We know he would prefer to have a different government in Ukraine, one that is in his own hands, although I'm not sure about all this information this morning about the particular names. They don't seem to add up. But the important thing is that I've met him on a number of occasions. I've dealt with him. I've had to stand up to him when we had the assassination on British soil. But he's an opportunist. He probably does not himself know what he's going to do next. We know what he wants to do. The question is what he will do. The important thing is, at this particular point in time, and there's going to be discussions, the Defense Secretary is going to Moscow, there's letters exchanged between America and the Russians. At this point, we've got to show strength. And that's, I think, what was something of an issue in the last few days, when it wasn't clear what the Germans were doing. The French were talking about a separate, or appeared to be talking about a separate deal that was a European deal with Russia. And of course, there is this issue about energy prices and what is actually going to happen if the flow of gas continues to slow to the west. All these issues are going to be taken into account, but the important thing is you've got to have a show of strength.
You said you weren't that sure about the intelligence which has been published today. Do you think the Foreign Office has... I mean, this is very unusual for the Foreign Office to publish this kind of intelligence. Do you think they've overstepped the mark here?
Well, I've no doubt that President Putin would prefer to establish a friend of his, as he had before, in control in Ukraine. And I've no doubt that he has possible people in mind if he was ever to be in this position. But the names that have been given don't necessarily seem to add up. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is, can you get the allies together? Can NATO show its power and its strength as a unified force? And can we force the Russians to back down? And I think, you know, from my knowledge of President Putin, he's an adventurist as well as an opportunist. But you must not give him an inch if you're going to stand up to Russian aggression.
OK, but by my reckoning, Gordon Brown, I don't think there's anybody who has been in Downing Street alive longer than you have as Chancellor and then Prime Minister. What do you make of the chaos that is engulfing Downing Street right now? And can you imagine the kind of thing that we are reading about taking place on your watch?
Well, this is indeed about standards in public life. Look, we know the government is immobilised, and despite what Dominic Raab says, the attention that is needed for the cost of living crisis, for the schools, for people to catch up as children in schools, for obviously Afghanistan, for Ukraine, for all the problems that are besetting the health service, the attention has veered towards dealing with these particular scandals. And my fear is that scandal is going to follow Boris Johnson as long as he's Prime Minister. You know, we don't just have the scandal, and all the details will probably come out later this week about partying. We have the conflicts of interest, we have the dubious appointments, we have foreign money and question marks over that, who's paying the bills for what, and I don't think we're going to see this administration end in anything other than scandal.
Are you saying to me that you think, looking at the current Prime Minister, that this is not a man with either the character or the moral stature to occupy the position of Prime Minister of this country?
I think it's about standards in public life. I'm not going to comment on Boris Johnson as an individual, but it is about standards in public life. And the minute the public realise that governments are asking their citizens to follow rules that they're not prepared to follow themselves, and the minute you have a question mark over behaviour and conduct in public life, that is indeed very serious, because when you're dealing with a pandemic and now with an economic cost of living crisis, the most important thing you need is that people are prepared to trust their leaders to get things right, and trust them to do things even when they're unpopular to get the right answers in the long run. So this is really an ethical issue. It's about the conduct of public life.
Having said that, the phrase that is going around this week is fish rots from the head. Very many people have said, this is not for me to make a judgment, many people have said that this kind of thing would never have happened with Theresa May, David Cameron, Tony Blair or Gordon Brown in number 10, because you set an example. Do you think that it is time for Mr. Johnson, if that is true, to go and to have someone who will set the right standards and the right kind of leadership, both of which you've mentioned this morning?
Well, Trevor, you know, I came on to talk about Afghanistan and about humanitarian crisis, and I feel that Boris Johnson should be dealing with this. And I don't want to make this simply about a person. I think it's the character of the government that is at issue. It's the standards in public life. And if I were him, I would be sure to say that we're going to have a massive review of all rules governing public life in this country, because clearly you cannot run Downing Street the way it's been run, you cannot make appointments in the way they've been made, and you cannot allow the sort of behaviour that has happened, and hope somehow the public will not notice when you're asking them to take decisions that you're not prepared to take themselves. Look, Sue Gray is going to report on the present issues.
All right, you're quite right to say let's focus on the things that matter. And before I let you go, can I just ask you one specific thing which probably you would know about better than anybody else in the world? You were the last person to hike national insurance. Do you think that the Chancellor should go ahead with that, or should it be delayed, as many people are suggesting?
Well, I'm not convinced that national insurance is the right tax to deal with the problems that we're facing, social care in particular. And I think Keir Starmer is right. You've got to look at people's standards of living as a whole and what costs they're going to have to bear. Look, I'm a patron of a charity in Fife, and we're dealing with poverty that I have not seen in my lifetime. We're dealing with people who can't heat their homes. We're dealing with children who are not going to school well-clad and going to school hungry. And we're dealing with a crisis amongst so many people because they are demoralised and facing mental health problems as a result of what has happened as a result of this crisis. Now, to impose upon those families an energy price rise in their heating bills and in their electricity, then to impose a tax rise for those who are paying national insurance at a time when food prices are also rising at the same time, and you've had this £20 cut in people's universal credit, it is simply not acceptable. And the devastating effect on poverty will be seen very quickly if all these things go ahead. So Keir Starmer has been right to say we've got to focus on what the living standards are of people at the moment and how they're going to be cut if we don't act.
Gordon Brown, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Now, as England moves back to Plan A, pupils will no longer have to wear masks. This term, all schools are expected to offer face-to-face teaching to every age group and online learning for those who are absent or isolating. The Children's Commissioner for England is worried about the thousands of children who have fallen off the radar during lockdown. So, as we move into living with COVID mode, just what has been the impact on our children and their education? I'm joined now by Rachel D'Souza, Children's Commissioner. Good morning, Dame
Morning,
Rachel.
Trevor. Morning.
Now, this week, the Prime Minister's told schools in England to end the wearing face masks. Some teaching unions and heads are pretty cross about this. They think it's premature. Where do you stand? Who's right?
Look, I think when I came into post in March, April, I did a survey of England's children and we got over 500,000 responses, the largest survey of children in England done, 4 to 18-year-olds from every part of the country. And do you know what children told me? They told me they wanted to get back to school. They wanted to deal with their mental health, mental well-being issues. They wanted to catch up. And the reason they wanted to do this was their great ambition for their own futures. They want great jobs, great careers, and to create families of their own. I have been down. So from that, I wanted to put children at the heart of recovery from the pandemic. Now, I've been at the school gates and talking to colleagues, and what children are telling me is, masks or not masks, we want to be back at school. It's great to be back, great to be together, great to be doing extracurricular things. Now, my worry is the large number of children who are not back, and that's what we should be focusing on now.
I want to come to that, if I may, in a second, but do you think that the lifting of the mask mandate is going to help in that aim that you set out or not?
So I think we focused a lot on masks, and I think a lot of children find it very hard to wear a mask all day. Some are anxious and want to wear them. I actually think the key thing is that they want to be back at school, and we should be looking at attendance, because if you're not at school, you can't learn and you can't recover.
All right. Well, look, the signs are that we are moving from pandemic to endemic. So in some way, we're moving to that new normal. Cycle of lockdowns is over. But you've been saying that the price that children have had to pay is very high, and you're now looking at this problem of children going off the radar. I mean, what is the cause of that, and what's the scale of it?
Yeah, so I think the scale is huge. Normally around this time, 95% of children would be in school. Looking at the figures last week, it was 87%. That's, with about 8.9 million children in England. That's a huge amount of children. Now, what children are telling me is that that some of them are not in for mental health concerns. They're not getting those met quickly enough and the treatment they need. For some, it's special educational needs. For some, it's truancy. But there's another group as well. And that group are not even on rolls. I was in a police county recently, and they showed me they had a list of children that they've come across who are not on anyone's rolls. So what I've done is called 10, I've got data gathering powers. And the first thing I've done is call 10 local authorities together and ask them some basic questions. I did an initial data sweep and asked them simply, how many children have you got in your area? How many are not at school? How many are waiting for school places? And they could not all answer those questions. So I've now written to all 141 local authorities. I'm working with DfE and with schools. For me, we need to do a number of things. We need to sort out the data and make sure that the management information is coming right through, and we can help with that. And I'm pushing, I'm working with local authorities and pushing the Department for Education to do something about that. It's 2022. Our data systems can deal with that, but also we need to be listening to children. And I'm going to make sure in those 10 areas and across the country, we really get to the bottom of what children need to get back to school so they can thrive.
OK, before we end, I do want to pick up the point that you raised about children's mental health. To what extent do you think this is merely a dip, a problem about the changed circumstances we've been living in for the last 2 years, I beg your pardon, from which we'll recover? And to what extent do you think something fundamental has changed that will affect this cohort of school children?
So before I did my survey, I would have gone with your former view. It's been a difficult time. It's a well-being issue, and if we get everyone back, it'll be fine. But the response to the Big Ask survey was overwhelming. It was the number one issue that children are telling me that they need to thrive, and that's right across the country. We got responses from every single local authority area. The number one issue was mental health and mental well-being. And so I think it's extremely serious, and we need to really make sure that children are getting the treatment they need. And I've been talking to Sajid Javid and looking at the NHS's plans to deal with children's mental health. I think it really is very serious indeed.
Dame Rachel de Souza, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, that's it from the main programme this morning. In a little while, after the break, I'll be talking to Sam Coates. We'll be back next week, no doubt, with latest moves on the Ukraine border. Who knows what Mr. Putin's going to do? There may be peace there, but I'm pretty sure there's not going to be peace in Downing Street or over in Westminster. More next Sunday.